Hello, everybody. This is Adrian Kerr, one of my adventures. This particular subject is one of my favorite, which is Egypt's pyramids, fact or fiction. So in the next hour or so, I'm going to take you through something like 4,500 years of history to explain why the pyramids were built, how they were built, and what they were used for. In the last 40 years or so, I have spent many visits to Egypt and many happy hours researching subjects, of which the pyramids are one of my favorite. And I think many people in the planet also feel that the pyramids are something special. My first book that I wrote was the one below, Ancient Egypt and Us, which talks about the impact of the ancient Egyptian world on the modern world. So let's take a look at Egypt. Always has been a sandy country, but the Great Nile, which rises in the south and flows north into the Mediterranean, has provided water for irrigation and therefore cultivation, therefore food, and therefore population growth. If you look at this slide, you'll see that the pyramids are invariably on the west side of the Nile, on the left-hand side of this picture, because that is the land of the dead. So the palaces and the cities were always on the east side of the Nile, and the pyramids and tombs nearly always on the west. And you can see they're spread out over a long snake from the current city of Cairo, Giza, all the way through to about an hour south of there, a place called Lahun. History has often speculated what was the purpose of pyramids. The Old Testament, for instance, in Genesis, mentions that Pharaoh had a dream of 7 lean cows that devoured 7 fat cows. Joseph was asked for advice, and he suggested that the Pharaoh should store grain, which in fact was very commonplace in ancient Egypt. In the early Byzantine Empire, the writer Julius Honorius actually referred to the pyramids as storehouses of Joseph. And then a little bit later, St. Mark's Basilica was built, and in the beautiful arches on the entrance to the basilica were scenes of the Old Testament, and this is one of my favorites. It shows mosaics of the pyramids being used to store grain. And so it was for many, many years thereafter that people believed that pyramids were a source of storage of grain. The pharaohs, or kings as they were called mostly, wanted to live in the afterlife when they died. To that, and they had to have their body intact, hence the idea of embalming and mummies. And they also had to place their bodies in a safe location, which was underground and deep down into the bedrock. And there were usually in the early days 2 tombs, one a false tomb and one where the king was buried, and the entrances were always from the roof. And these were often built in mud brick. One of the early ancient Egyptian burial sites was Abydos, and rather gruesomely, we found evidence of servants dying with their king. By 2900 or so BC, Egypt has become much bigger. It extends into Sinai and also up as far as Libya. And the first king who began to consider alternative construction methods was a king called Khazakemwy around about 2700 BC. And he decided to build his mastaba tomb, shown here on the right-hand side, not in brick, but in stone. The king who actually produced the first pyramid, his name was Djoser, and we call it a step pyramid because, as you can see from this picture, we have a number of layers, mastabas, which have got smaller as they rise vertically. And the concept here was that the kings at this time in the Old Kingdom were god kings, and this was their methodology of getting to the gods who lived in heaven. The big open area in front of the south face you can see there was an area where the king had to run on a regular basis to demonstrate to his people, and the priests particularly, that he was worthy to continue to be a king. The great designer who came up with this stepped pyramid was Imhotep. And in the early days of the building of pyramids, there was usually a northern entrance, which is on the other side of this picture, and a southern entrance, representing that Egypt, in legend, was formed by joining the northern kingdom with the southern kingdom. This is a diagrammatic representation of how they started off with a mastaba tomb, the dark brown area, and the king came along later with his architect and said, let's make it wider and longer. And the next step was, let's build a mastaba on top of that, and on top of that, and on top of that, and so on, until you have the structure that you can see there. The huge structure coming out of the desert is equivalent to actually the structure underground. As you can see, the access from the north comes in from the right-hand side, down sloping galleries, and at the bottom of the major shaft, where he was buried, there is a miniature town where he would store food for the afterlife, wine, images of his supporters, army, and religious, and of course wives. And this was a massive underground city, effectively, which only recently has been stabilized to allow visitors. The only surviving image of this great king Djoser is shown on the right-hand side, and you can see that some of the colors which were extensively used in Egyptian construction are still present. One of the visits I made in 2018, I took this picture because it showed the work that's being done and is now complete, but it took 3 years to do so, to actually stabilize the levels of the mastabas and to remove any excessive debris which had occurred, and to give it a smoother, more stable construction so they would last for hopefully another couple of thousand years. Here's a close-up of the extensive scaffolding where the east face here is being stabilized and broken pieces of stone are being replaced and rubble removed. If you notice carefully, this particular construction, the earliest of the pyramids of size in Egypt, was made not out of huge blocks, which you're going to see later when we get to Giza, but of small blocks. Because remember, this is a brand new, innovative design. Never have they built such a huge structure before, and they're rather nervous that the stability of the pyramid may not necessarily be strong enough for the years to come. So they took the decision to put slanted stones to support the structure, and you can see the slanted stones there leaning against the flat stones. This was called accretion, and the idea was that we're not too sure how strong this structure is, but we certainly don't want it to fall down, so let's bolster it. A bit like a buttress. You can see behind those stones the rubble that was used to fill the pyramid. The outer pyramid that we see today, of course, was the side, was the surface that we would see and admire, but inside the pyramid, all manner of different sized stones and shale were used just to produce a core. This is a reconstructed set of festival chapels done by the French archaeologist in the 20s, all the way through for about 60 years, and he reconstructed these as he thought they looked out of modern stone. So there's some debate as to whether this is completely accurate, but it gives a very good indication of what the festival chapels, where various gods were housed, which circumvented all of the great stepped pyramid, which you can just see in the scaffolding behind. The entrance to the religious precinct, which, by the way, was only accessible by the kings, some nobles, and the priests, was this wonderful bundle of reeds from the distance. When you get close, of course, they're not made out of reeds. This is made out of stone, but it represents the reeds that were used for the houses and the palaces. Even the king's palace would have been supported, the roof would have been supported by wooden groups of reeds like this. And so it was that they transferred the design from their own houses and palaces into the precinct of Djoser. I really became very excited in March of 2020 because after many, many years of reconstruction and stabilization, finally, the pyramid was now in a state where the scaffolding could be taken away, and there was a grand opening ceremony, and Djoser's pyramid is now open to the public. In my lifetime, it has not been possible to enter the pyramid because of stability concerns, but that's something to look forward to on the next visit. I then decided to move further south to a king's set of pyramids called Snefru. He was a son of Djoser, and he decided to build his first pyramid about an hour south of Djoser's, his father's pyramid. You can see here I was provided with an army escort because this is quite a remote location. And in the distance, you can see what in fact is a pyramid. And I'll explain to you why it has that peculiar shape. But you can see at the bottom, there's a pile of debris, which is 150 feet high, and then a core of a pyramid on the top of that. And when you get closer, you can see that this pyramid has at some time collapsed. Snefru built this at a place called Meidum in modern name, and it started off as a step pyramid like his father's Djoser. But at the end of the construction, he decided that he wanted to actually make this a smooth pyramid, and so he started adding casing stones. But the stability of the casing stones and the accretion method that was used was unstable. And either through earthquake or movement of the foundations, the outer casing collapsed, and with it, it ripped out a lot of the core. As you can see, there are holes here in the north and west face, which have been caused by the outer casing stones being ripped out. And that area in the foreground is debris, which has been left over from the collapse of the pyramid. This is an easier way to actually see what the pyramid would look like at the time it was constructed and finished. The yellow area, of course, is the debris level today, but you can see how the mastaba system was used, and then the final casing stones were laid against it. As I mentioned, was not strong enough, and the foundations gave way, and is left with a stump. So what you're seeing today is the pink area, the stump of the pyramid is left behind after the collapse. The entrance to the chamber, as ever, is on the north. Entrance chamber is underground, just about. And to prevent the tomb where the king was going to be buried from collapsing, with all the weight of the roughly 1.5 million tons of blocks on top of it, they produce a very cunning design called corbelling, where each of the layers of stones in the tomb are slightly inwards, and so it takes the stress of all the weight of the pyramid above the tomb sideways through the walls of the pyramid, and therefore doesn't cause the tomb itself to crack. Well, Snefru was not happy that his pyramid had collapsed, and he decided not to have his burial there, and he moved a little bit further north to Djoser, and we call this the bent pyramid because of its unique shape. And the reason why it looks like this is because they started off with a 60-degree angle, shown in the left-hand corner drawing, and then they decided to make it wider, and they changed to a 54-degree angle. But as they became more complete, cracks started to appear, and by the time it was nearly 3/4 complete in terms of stone being installed, the cracks were so bad that the tomb, in fact, was shown to have cracks in the ceiling, and the call went out to bring in cedar trees from Lebanon, which was a 10-week sea journey in those days. And you can see the beams were laid down on the entrance area and had the intention to be used in the tomb itself to hold the ceiling up and stop it from cracking. Well, they decided it was beyond hope, and they decided not to try and hold up that ceiling and just finish off the pyramid as quickly as they could. And so they reduced the angle from the 54 degrees to 44 degrees, and that is why you see this discontinuity in the angle of the pyramid. The pyramid of Djoser is many, many miles away from the future ancient cities and the Middle Ages cities and modern cities, and that is why the casing stones of the middle of this particular pyramid have remained almost intact. This picture shows that the casing stones on the right-hand side are intact, and only the stones in the foreground have been robbed. And this is the most intact casing of any pyramid of the Old Kingdom. And this photograph I took to show just how dramatically impressive the cracks are between the slabs of the casing stones. The joints themselves, you cannot put a piece of paper between them, and they were joined together just by good stonemasons, not by using bitumen or by concrete. So this is naturally high quality stonemason work. Unfortunately, as the years have gone by and regimes have changed in Egypt, so the amount of money that's been allocated to protect the great buildings, tombs, pyramids of ancient Egypt has declined, and consequently it's sad to report that from 2013 onwards you start to see graffiti appearing, which in the 20 years I've been visiting Egypt before that, it would never be seen because of the military guards that were present by the pyramids themselves. But this picture is interesting for another reason, in that you can see that the outer casing stones are beautifully smooth and give a nice flat white limestone effect, which then becomes orangey and red as the sun rises. But inside, the core was just thrown together, and you can see the rough blocks we used, they weren't finished, and there were cracks between them. But it's the casing stones which really made the pyramid stable and also gave it its beautiful appearance. This is a fascinating pyramid because although it has the odd structure we talked about earlier, it has two entrances. The classical north entrance was abandoned because of the cracks in the tomb, and so a second entrance was added on the west. And you can see on the right-hand side of this image that the entrance is pretty much halfway up the side of the pyramid. But just in case, the two tombs were joined together, but as I mentioned earlier, it was too badly damaged for the king to feel it was a suitable place to be buried, so he was never buried in this second pyramid. And I have a bit of a test for you. This is the west face, and you can see just about where the entrance was. Now, of course, at the time of completion, that whole face would have been covered in casing stones, and you would not have been able to see that particular square recess, which represents the entrance to the top corridor. And so it would have been very, very difficult to, by chance, find the entrance to the pyramids. But the people who knew where the entrances were and why the tombs were robbed within the lifetime of the builder was because the priests and the architects knew exactly where the entrances were. Again, excitement, because I have not been allowed to enter this pyramid in all the times I've been going to Egypt, but the government in Egypt has tried to promote more locations for tourists to visit, and they have excitedly opened this to the public in July 2019 with great fanfare. So another new pyramid to go into next time you visit. So finally, Snefru, having had two collapsed pyramids or damaged pyramids, now becomes extremely conservative and instructs the final of his three pyramids to be built in a rather squat, flat-looking way, because the angle of the pyramid is only 43 degrees. It's almost as if it's like a classical Giza pyramid in Cairo, where somebody's actually pressed down on it and made it more squat. But we shouldn't forget that this king produced three pyramids, and the size of this last pyramid, the base of it was almost the same size as the largest pyramid ever built by Khufu, we're going to come on to next. And the king was also innovative in the sense that he actually wanted his tomb to be above ground. And he was satisfied with the structure and the stability of this particular pyramid, which is called a red pyramid because of the color of the sandstone that was used. And he was buried in this location. It is a fascinating pyramid. It's been open for many years, and it's really quite a marvelous experience to actually enter into the pyramid and to move through the clever designs that the architects had produced. On the left-hand side is a representation of a means to try and stop tomb robbers from getting into the third chamber where the king was buried. So they produced three chambers in total. The first chamber, in fact, was meant to put the robbers off because there was no obvious exit. And the first chamber had a hidden door at the bottom of the wall, which eventually the robbers found, of course. And then they moved along a small horizontal passageway until they got into the second chamber. They would have looked for a similar hidden door at the base of the wall without success, but they did manage, by using ladders, to find the exit from the second chamber to the third chamber high up in the corbel ceiling. And in modern times, this wooden structure has been built to allow tourists to climb up to the exit point, which leads them on to the burial chamber where the king finally was laid to rest. And here you can see that the tomb robbers did in fact make it through the outer chambers, and they found the wonderful corbel ceiling again, but they were so disappointed that there wasn't as much material to rob that they believed that the real treasure was underground. And you can see the floor of the tomb has actually been hacked away, and it's been left like that from the ancient tomb robbers' work. Now we move about 30 miles north to the modern city of Giza. And this is called the Giza Plateau because, as you can see from the profile on the left-hand side, this would have been many tens of feet above the level of the Nile. Now, the Nile has moved eastwards over the last few thousand years. So you would have to imagine that the Nile, when these pyramids were built, ran along the base of the plateau. And here's a representation of what the three Great Pyramids would have looked like after construction. And on the left-hand side, you can see the harbors that were produced to allow stone to be brought in, and also finally the king to be brought across from the land of the living in the east to the land of the dead to be placed safely inside his pyramid. So this is what it would have looked like at its height. But of course, over the years, a lot of the stonework that you can see, particularly the causeways running down to the valley, have disappeared completely. Today, the Giza city has moved right up to the escarpment, and fortunately, nobody's allowed to dwell on the escarpment, so there's a stop been made to the expansion of Giza, and you can see just how close it gets to the three Great Pyramids. So on the left-hand side is the greatest of them all, Khufu's, King Khufu, then his son, Khafre, and then his son, Menkaure, on the right, which is appreciably smaller, and we'll explain why that is in a moment. So the largest stone pyramid ever constructed in the history of Egypt is the one built by Khufu, around about 2500 BC. Although it should be said, although this is the largest structure, Snefru had used 40% more stone in building his three pyramids that we talked about just now. If you look down the left-hand side, bottom left, you can see a couple of features. First of all, you can see the small pyramids there, three of them, and these were for the wives of the king who could not be buried in the main pyramid itself. That's only for the king. And you can see two large holes in the ground, and these were the holes where the boats that brought the royal family and the king, after he had died, across the river to be placed in his tomb in the center of the pyramid. And then the boats were dismantled and buried, and only recently, in the last century, have they been excavated, and I'll show you that they've been reconstructed. And these boats are waterproof, river-going boats, which were broken into small pieces and buried for spiritual reasons. The black area on the bottom left-hand corner is the base of the mortuary temple. The mortuary temple was a structure which housed the priests of Khufu, and he left enough money and lands for the priests to say his name repeatedly, which kept him alive in the afterlife, provide him with food, and also makeup for his statue, and to have new clothes. So they kept him alive by that fashion, and it's reputed that the actual worship of the dead king in the mortuary temple went on for many hundreds of years, even though the king had long gone. The entrance to the pyramid, as ever, was on the north, and you can see this gable end here. This is where the entrance was originally designed to be. Of course, the architects and the priests knew where the entrance was, and they robbed the pyramid probably within 30 years of the king dying. The entrance was covered up again, and in the Middle Ages, one of the Islamic leaders of Egypt at the time, the Caliph al-Mamun, managed to find his way into the pyramid by using a different entrance, where the tourists are going in right now at the bottom of the picture. So when you enter this pyramid today, you go in through this particular entrance, which was produced by heating up the stones and pouring vinegar on them until it found its way into the center of the pyramid and joined up with the classical entrance area. The fascinating picture here shows you what the pyramid would have looked like when it had been completed. Today, we only see the inner rough stones, but on the bottom, on the corner, you can see here we have the fine Chura white limestone called casing stones, and that would have progressed all the way up the sides of all four of the sides of the pyramid and joined at the top in the pyramidion. And this would have been glowing orange and yellow as the sun rose, and it would have been a wonderful sight. But the casing stones are very high quality limestone, and over the many hundreds of years, people have robbed the pyramid of its casing stone, and all that's left are these very few pieces at the bottom of the pyramid itself. I mentioned that the top had a structure called a pyramidion, and this would have been covered in silver and gold, a mixture called electrium, and that would have shone first when the sun came over the horizon in the east. And it was dismantled and fell to the bottom of the sides of the pyramid and was just left as rubble, but they've reconstructed it there to show you what it would look like. And so if you look at the top of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, it's actually flat. This is the boat that I mentioned. This was the first one to be taken out of the boat pit, reassembled over many years, and it is completely seaworthy and would have brought the king across the river after he died to be taken up to his final burial place in the tomb in the pyramid. Khufu's pyramid is probably the most complicated from an internal design point of view. And it's probably because he lived for long enough to be able to change the design as the pyramid was being built. Initially, as you can see, if you see the number 1 in this left-hand picture, this would have been the descending passageway from the north down to the bedrock, number 2. And there is a room was started, and the conjecture is that this might have been where he wanted to be buried. There's also a counter view that this was never intended to be his final burial place. It was just a representation of perhaps a second chamber, as in the common areas of having a northern entrance and a southern entrance that we saw in Djoser. Maybe this represented the southern kingdom. Anyway, the decision was made to have the king interred higher up above ground, and you can see that you come in from the passageway, and then it changes vertically, and it goes horizontally again, and you end up at the area called 3, and this was originally intended to be where the king was laid to rest. Well, he came back some years later and decided he wanted to be buried higher up. And so the final resting place is where it says number 4, and that's where his sarcophagus is today. Many people call the chamber 3 as the queen's chamber, but of course, as I mentioned earlier, queens were never buried in pyramids, only for the male rulers. And now the designers had a problem. They have decided to put the sarcophagus in a beautiful lined room with red granite from Aswan, 500 miles north of the area of the tomb. But they're really concerned that the 1.5 to 2 million tons of rock above this tomb, and it's got a flat roof if you notice, that it would crumble, crack, and then crush the sarcophagus and the king's body. So they built the very interesting structure which actually allowed the weight of the pyramid above the burial chamber to be spread through the walls of the pyramid, and thereby not having a collapse of the roof. And in fact, they did a really good job because the roof is still very, very intact today. Those are called stress-relieving chambers. And to get to them, they went up this incline passageway 5, which in fact has got a very high roof, as you can see on the right-hand side. These are people climbing down. And to protect this structure from collapse from the weight of the stones above, it also had corbelling, which spread the weight onto the sides of the pyramid. We didn't know the name of the king who built this pyramid until the 19th century, when an English captain took dynamite and blasted his way up through the stress-relieving chambers, which are seen in this lower drawing. And he was amazed to find there was graffiti between the chambers, and the graffiti is shown on the left-hand side. And this is the only indication that we know historically of who built this pyramid. And the cartouche itself, with a chick, a snake, a chick, and then the sun, is Khufu in hieroglyphics. And this is his cartouche. And the people who built these stress relieving chambers took a break. And this is graffiti that they produced saying that we, the construction company, built these stress relieving chambers, and it was the whole pyramid was dedicated to the god King Khufu. The only surviving image of Khufu is this tiny ivory statue, which is only about 4 inches high, on the right-hand side there. The construction is amazing. It's survived for 4,500 years, pretty much intact. It made up of over 2 million blocks, averaging 2 tons each. It took about 17 years to build, which fits because the reign of Khufu was 23 years. And initially, there were 20,000 workers required to build the bottom part of the pyramid. And then as it got narrower, less stone was needed, and so progressed to only maybe 5,000 when the top part was finished. The scale of this pyramid is truly impressive. It's 480 feet high and 756 the base. And this was the tallest structure on the planet for 4,000 years until the English Gothic cathedrals were built in the late Middle Ages. How did these pyramids, how were they constructed? The first theory was that it was they were constructed by building a very long ramp into the desert, and the stones would be dragged up the ramp and then put in place. But this doesn't make sense because the amount of work required to build such a ramp and then dismantle it was inordinate. And instead, they went for a more intelligent system called a spiral ramp. So initially, there'd be a simple, straightforward, traditional ramp. But as the pyramid rose out of the sand, they went away from having a single ramp and went for the spiral ramp, which is very well illustrated in this picture on the right-hand side. The spiral ramp was actually made out of mud brick. And so as the final stones were taken to the top of the pyramid, so the casing stones were added and the mud brick spiral ramp was chipped away. And it's kind of counterintuitive. They actually started casing the pyramid from the top to the bottom. The ramp to the pyramid, in fact, has now mostly gone, but excavation work has shown that the quarry shown in a circle here, where the stone was cut, was actually raised up these ramps to the pyramid itself, and the remnants of the ramps have been found quite recently, which just reinforces the fact that the stone actually came from quarries very close to where the pyramid was built, which makes a lot of sense. The next two pyramids shown there, Khafre and Menkaure, also had their own quarries nearby. So fundamentally, the base stones which went into the core of the pyramids came from local quarries, but the beautiful white limestone came from a place called Djoser, and that was brought across the river and then up the ascending ramp, which I showed in the early picture of the three pyramids by the Giza settlements. Mark Lehner conducted a very interesting piece of excavation after 2000, and he worked on an area in the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see in the shadow of the pyramids, and it had never been worked on before, and he excavated a remarkable village, a village which probably housed 20,000 people. There were cow and fish bones everywhere, there was ash and refuse, there were bakeries and breweries, and it's come to be accepted that this is the pyramid builders' village. And then the question is often asked, who built the pyramids? Hebrew slaves, perhaps? Well, that hasn't really declined in popularity because this village really looked after very well the people who helped build the pyramids. And it's now believed that the peasant farmers, which made up 99.9% of the population of Egypt, couldn't work their fields when the inundation came and the Nile flowed over the banks, and they had to wait for 3 months before they could plant crops and then harvest them. So instead of staying in their villages, they volunteered to work for the king, whether it be building a tomb or a palace or a pyramid. And for the 90 days of the inundation, they would work and they would be fed and given beer, and then they would go back and plant their fields. This type of exchange for taxation is called a corvée system, and these were the people who did the heavy lifting. They moved the crude blocks from the quarries up to the actual plateau itself, where they were handed over to expert stonemasons who trimmed them and put them in position. So this was a town for tomb workers, and there was an area of that where the skilled craftsmen would have lived for the whole duration of construction of the pyramid. We know that they were looked after because we found that the pensions were given to those people who got hurt. There's people who had limbs amputated who were given wheat rations for the rest of their lives, and people who had injuries to their head from falling stones, brain surgery was offered. So these people were very valuable. They were not slaves. There's a lot of New Age thinking as to who built the pyramids, and there's also a very great interest in, are there any more spaces within the pyramid? Now, of course, the authorities would not allow any further excavation work to be taken place inside the pyramid for obvious reasons. And so it's been left to modern science to actually do the excavation by doing scanning work. And the Muon scanning project on Khufu's pyramid took place in 2017. And the results were tantalizing. The scanning process found two voids, as they see it, inside the pyramid. One, the long one above the Grand Gallery, which you can see, and the second one near the entrance. Unexplained, and of course, without actually entering into that part of the pyramid, we'll never find out exactly whether that is really a void, a tomb, and a treasure area. But it also could be just a change in density in the stones or a void for other purposes. We shall find out maybe one day. The next pyramid was the son of Khufu. His name was Khafre. He took the name of the worship of Re, the sun god. And it's interesting to see the casing that's been left today. And that casing has been there since the 17th century. Greaves, the English traveler in 1646, said when he was there in the middle of the 17th century that the casing was completely intact, which implies that the casing has been stripped away in the last 200 or 300 years and used for construction of houses, mosques, and sugar factories because it's convenient to Cairo. And that top of the casing is all that's left behind. This is one of my favorite pictures of Khafre's pyramid. And here you can see, because of the effect of the floodlights, there's the top of the pyramid with the casing stones pretty much intact. And then the bottom of the pyramid, you can see the rough types of stone that were used for the core before the casing stones were applied. The height of those stones varies. They're not even in a horizontal fashion completely. But as you notice, the top third of the pyramid, suddenly the architects get really serious and they use consistent size blocks, absolutely horizontal, because if they don't get the top third completely correct, instead of being a nice pyramid shape, the top part will squirm and look very peculiar indeed from a distance. Is Khafre's pyramid taller than his father's? It certainly looks that way, but in fact the height of the pyramid is less than his father's, but it was actually constructed on a higher piece of the Giza plateau. This picture I took in 2016, and it was astonishing. There were troubles in Egypt at that time, if you remember, and the number of tourists had declined dramatically. Here is an interesting development in pyramid construction. Remember I showed you the casing stones of Khufu's pyramid, which was made out of limestone? Well, this is his son's pyramid, and his son is beginning to think, I need to outdo my father. I will use a higher quality stone, which gives a nice red finish when the sun comes up. And he started to use the bottom 2 or 3 layers of the pyramid casing stones to be made out of red granite coming from Aswan, 500 miles south of Cairo. And you can see here the remnants of the casing stones, and to the left of this area are broken pieces of casing stones, which actually Khafre must have died before the actual granite was put in place. One of the most marvelous things about the pyramids in Giza is the fact that they had very extensive mortuary temples and valley temples. And there we found some astonishingly beautiful images. And this is the god king Khafre. And this was found in his mortuary temple, buried and safe. And it shows the god Horus, the hawk, who carried the sun on his back throughout the day. And here you have a wonderful example of the god king Khafre saying that the god Horus is actually protecting me. And this is one of the most beautiful pieces of work in ancient Egypt. His burial chamber was not as grand as his father's, and it had instead of a flat roof, which is susceptible to cracking, it had a roof shown here. And the explorer and robber Belzoni, around the time of 1818, made his way into the tomb for the first time in modern times, and this is the graffiti that he left on the wall of the tombs. Khafre's pyramid was unusual, and it had two entrances: the upper entrance, which Bolzoni used, and then an English explorer found a second entrance lower down. It's never quite been explained why the decision was made to have two. Something to do with the orientation of the pyramid, its size initially, and change in size, it probably explains it. This picture is very important because it shows that the Giza plateau is not flat. And to make a flat foundation for Khafre's pyramid, they had to dig down about 50 feet through the bedrock to make it even for the foundation stones. And this picture tells you a lot about the rise and fall of the Giza plateau. And you can see in the distance is the smallest of the three pyramids, Menkaure. We'll come on to that one next. Menkaure realized he had competing pyramids. His father was the giant Khufu pyramid. His grandfather. His father made almost a big pyramid next door, and so he decided that he couldn't compete with that, and instead he would make it beautiful. And he did that by following from his father's idea of using granite, red granite casing stones. And he got further than his father did. You can see there are 16 rows of red granite casing, but he died before it could be finished. In fact, the rows stopped and the smoothing of the stones around the entrance walkway you can see today only went as far as 3 or 4 stones on either side of the tomb entrance. The rest of the stones were there to be smoothed, but the king had died, and so the work was never finished. The gash here was created by Saladin's son, who ruled Cairo around about 13th century, mid-13th century, and he believed that the pyramids were inappropriate in Islam, and he gave orders for the smallest pyramid to be removed. But after 8 months of work, they were only able to remove 2 stones a day from the face, and they realized it would never be done in their lifetime. So they stopped demolishing the pyramid, but the gash is still there today. And this is fascinating because what I'm pointing to is the red granite stone, which was now completely smooth by the entrance, as you can see on the right-hand side, top right. And I'm pointing to very worn writing. And the writing says that this pyramid was constructed by the god king Menkaure. And so this is one of the few examples where the casing stones have not been robbed, and it gives us a very clear indication that Menkaure built this pyramid. It's at a curved burial chamber, and the English explorer Vesey in the early 19th century removed the sarcophagus and shipped it back to England, but the ship sank in the Bay of Biscay and it was lost at sea and never made it back to England. And the lid did, in a separate voyage, make it back, and it's in the British Museum today. On the left-hand side is just a reminder how complex the underground structures were of these pyramids, almost like Djoser's, with little rooms where storage could be made for food and wine and possessions and small effigies of people who live with him in the afterlife, portcullis blocks to protect robbers, and then eventually you find your way winding around the various rooms to the position where the sarcophagus was placed. George Reisner in 1902 was given permission to excavate the area of Menkaure. It hadn't been dug down before, and so he's often called the origin of the Indiana Jones movies, and he was given the area of Giza to excavate. And he ended up with Menkaure's pyramid. And there he discovered the Valley Temple in 1908. And when they excavated the Valley Temple, through the floor was found, sticking vertically, as you can see, stunningly, beautifully preserved images of the king and his wife. And they had been buried there during probably the Persian invasion to avoid them being stolen. And when they're restored and placed in the British Museum, they are astonishingly beautiful and probably some of the finest artwork ever made in the whole history of ancient Egypt. And this is a picture of me standing beside it because they're very modest in size. These are only about 2.5 to 3 feet high, but they're impeccably made. And the one on the right is my favorite because here's the god king Menkaure with his wife, and she has the same height as him approximately, which shows, unlike many cases where wives are shown much, much smaller, that there's a lot of affection between the king and his wife. And in fact, you can see her right hand is holding his waist. This is a beautiful, romantic piece of sculpture. Many people ask the question, when was the Sphinx built and who does the face represent? And it really stems from identifying the three great pyramids in Giza and the various causeways which took the body of the kings up to each of these individual pyramids to be buried. And speculation has been rife as to the location of the Sphinx. Does it indicate the king who would have created it and his face on the face of the Sphinx today? If I want to show this picture because the second pyramid of Khafre in the middle, the causeway is not perpendicular to the face where the Mochi temple was. You can see it's bent southwards. So when they built the pyramid of Khafre, clearly the Sphinx was already there, and they had to move the orientation of the causeway so that it didn't interfere with the Sphinx itself. So the implication is that, in fact, it could well be his father, Khufu. Although if you stand on the Giza Plateau today and look up towards the Khufu pyramid, it's remarkable that the Sphinx is almost perfectly in line with the face. The face of the Sphinx is very difficult to pin down. One has been very heavily weathered, and despite the sand storms and also rain over the years, you can still see traces of paint on his forehead, on his Nema's headdress, and so it was that many people tried to research the shape of his face, and the most likely face that represents a king is that of his son, Djedefre, who built his pyramid well north of Giza, and then it was later taken apart by the Romans. And it's probably likely that Djedefre, who had to bury his father, that was the job of the eldest son, actually had this made in either his own face design or that of his father. Many people ask what happened to the beard. Well, the beard, of course, was added much later. The kings didn't have necessarily beards in the days of the Old Kingdom. It was added later, we know that, and parts of it in the British Museum today. And what happened to his nose? Well, images of humans are prohibited in Islam, and one of the local leaders, religious leaders, had the nose chipped off around about 1400 AD. The Sphinx is very important from a much later king's point of view, in that Moses IV, who was not the crown prince, was hunting in the shadow of the Sphinx and the pyramids many, many years later, 1,000 years later. And the story goes that he wanted to prove to his people that he was, although not the crown prince, he was the one chosen by the god Sphinx, because the Sphinx was worshipped for hundreds and hundreds of years. The story goes that he fell asleep in the hot summer, and he slept between the paws of the Sphinx, and he had a dream. And the dream was that the Sphinx god said, "You will be the next ruler of Egypt." And to show that that happened, he put the stela between his paws. You can see the stone block with inscriptions between the paws of the Sphinx. If you look more carefully at that stela, you can see not one Sphinx, but two Sphinx, which has been the origin of the fact that, okay, we have one Sphinx which has survived, and there was a second Sphinx at some time, which was demolished perhaps. And this rumor has been since the 11th century. There's no evidence whatsoever for that. And when you look more carefully at this particular piece of stone, the Sphinx, in fact, is the same on both sides, and the king is the same on both sides. And it's just, he is wearing a different crown on the left from the crown on the right. So it is not suggesting there's two Sphinxes, it's just it's been misinterpreted over the years. And this is the speculation. If there was a Sphinx, this is where it should be, but there's no evidence whatsoever. Many, many people have written that the Sphinx, in fact, covers chambers, and various people have published books which say there are two large chambers connected by a passageway, and there are cavities in the body full of treasure. Well, beware of moldy old New Age legends, because there's no evidence whatsoever. There is, in fact, a small hole at the base of the Sphinx, at his rear. But when it was entered, it stopped after about 8 or 10 feet, and there was certainly no treasure. The Great Pyramids of Egypt are often thought to be of stone, but in fact, in the Second Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, which took over when the older kingdom faded away through to ecological effects of global warming in the Middle East and particularly in Egypt and Iraq, it saw the demise of established civilizations. And it was a few hundred years later before a new kingdom arose and had central government reimposed, and we call that the Middle Kingdom. And around about 1900, the great king Amenemhet III constructed this pyramid, which, looking at it, you'd be hard pressed to think this is a pyramid. It looks more like a stump in the desert. The reason why it looks like that is because the core of the pyramid was made out of sun-dried mud bricks and had no great strength. But of course, it was cased in white limestone, but the casing over the years has been stolen, and eventually the core has degraded. As you can see, the bottom picture shows a view from the air, and in time, this stump, unless it's protected, will eventually completely wear away. It's called the Black Pyramid in Djoser. It's 220 feet high, or it would have been at its when it was constructed, but the problem, apart from the fact of robbing of the casing stones, was that the pyramid was built too close to the Nile, and so flooding reduced the strength of the foundation, and groundwater crept in, weakened the structure, and it probably would have begun to crumble even before the casing stones began to be stolen. The interesting thing about Amenemhet's ruined pyramid is the pyramidion has actually survived. And this is a very unusual case because it would have fallen off the pyramid and it was found at the base of the pyramid in the rubble. And here it gives the name of the king. So we know who Amenemhet III built this pyramid. And there are inscriptions below the wings which say that he, Amenemhet III, built the pyramid and he's looking at the god Ra. Now, if you look carefully at the hieroglyphics to the left of the goose, you can see that somebody has scratched away part of the hieroglyphics. And this is fascinating because the word Amun, as in Amenemhet, has been removed, which probably was done during the period of Akhenaten's reign, when the religion switched away from Amun-Ra to the worship of the Aten. The pyramid was abandoned because of structural collapse, and more pyramids were built. The second pyramid was called the White Pyramid, also built by the same king, somewhat further away, about 45 minutes drive into the desert. And after the Black Pyramid failed, the so-called White Pyramid was built, but it suffered a similar fate in that the casing stones were robbed, and over the years you can see that the damage has been caused by mostly water runoff, as Egypt has become wetter in the last few hundred years than it was when this pyramid was built. And you can see the effect of the little rivers running down the side of this pyramid. This is the core of the pyramid, made out of sun-dried brick and isn't strong enough to stop erosion. And again, in time, sadly, this pyramid will become smaller and smaller and more damaged. The pyramid is also very sad to report that over the years, the entrance to the pyramid and the tomb itself in the center of the pyramid has become flooded. The reason for that is that the cash crop now in this part of Egypt is sugar. To grow sugar, you have to apply a lot of water. Canals have been produced and irrigation is extended to the point where the sugar fields are constantly being kept wet. And this has raised the floodplain and the water table. And so now you can see that you cannot enter into the tomb of the pyramid because the water table is so close to the surface. Steps are in hand here and elsewhere to actually start to build a dike around some of these structures, and then to use electric pumps to pump out water to stop any damage which may occur because of the rising water temple. Here is also a Middle Kingdom pyramid built by another king, Senusret II. This is at Lahun, and here you can see that he cheated. he didn't start off on the base level of the desert. He actually built his pyramid on top of an outcrop of rock. If you're thinking of visiting Egypt, you should keep in mind always that this is an Islamic country and they have certain dress codes. And when I take groups of people to Egypt to show them the wonderful surviving pyramids or palaces or Valley of the Kings, I always say the night before our trip to please wear very modest clothing. And most people take notice of that. As you can see, the lady on the left there is perfectly well dressed and fits in the standard that people expect. The lady in the middle perhaps hadn't taken notice of the memo. Very sad occasion for me was April 2013 when I was taking pictures of the Great Pyramid Khufu, and the army were going to do a video to show on television the following day, which was Army Day, and they sent a Chinook helicopter to the top of the pyramid, and they let two soldiers come out of the helicopter, and you can see they're waving to the Chinook helicopter pilot to say, "We're safe, you can move off now." Well, sadly, the downdraft from those two great rotors destabilized the two soldiers, and sadly, they lost their footing and fell down to the bottom of the pyramid and died. The support that I tried to give the University of Chicago and Ray Johnson, who's been running the project for many years now, over 20 years, and his job is to restore and log the actual ancient writing of not so much the pyramids anymore, but of the great temples that have survived all these years. And he and his team have been working on recording the writing on these walls for many, many years and restoring the foundation where appropriate. And I wanted to give him a big thank you, and any funds that we raise from our books and talks go to help his team. So I'd like to end by saying this is the common understanding of how the pyramids were built and why they were built. But of course, there's always New Age people who completely contradict that and believe that the pyramids were built by space aliens. And here is an excellent example of some of the things that you'll see on the internet which support that theory. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my talk on pyramids. It's been a pleasure to do so, and I hope to see you on a future occasion on Adrian's Travels. Take care.